I think a very powerful place to start this conversation is with some news. As you all know, the Reverend Jesse Jackson passed away last month, and tomorrow, at least 3 presidents, Democratic presidents, will gather in Chicago for his homegoing service, one of which will be, of course, President Barack Obama, President Joe Biden, and then the Clintons, both of them, will be there, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris. So many other dignitaries will gather to celebrate his life. You were blessed with the opportunity to meet him and to talk to him and to know him a little bit. And you wrote an obit for the Washington Post prior to his passing that recently appeared. And talk a little bit, reflect a little bit about the late, great Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Well, let's see. The first time I really had a conversation with him would have been sometime after around 2005, 2006, because I had already started writing a column. I know it was after I started my column in 2005 because he called me about something I had written, and he thought that there were points that I had not that I had not made that he wished I had, and Reverend Jackson, when he had something to say, he generally speaking had a lot to say. So we were on the phone for a long time, but that started. That was the first of quite a few such conversations. He was just a remarkable person, and the piece that I wrote, it was an advance sort of column obituary that I wrote, zeroed in on 3 moments from his 3 images that I took away. One was him on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. It was actually the day before Reverend Dr. King was assassinated, when he was a young activist. One was him addressing the Democratic Convention in 1988, when he had run, a national campaign for president that won primaries and caucuses in 11 states, and something that had never been done before by an African-American candidate. And then the last one was him in Grant Park in Chicago, the night that Barack Obama was elected, and Reverend Jackson standing there and the tears.
Oh, the tears.
Right, and those, and there was only one time I ever ran into Reverend Jackson, and he had nothing to say, and he was speechless, and this was, it was Hurricane Katrina, and it was the week after the flood. I was in New Orleans writing columns, seeing things that I never thought I would see in this country or see at all. It was just horrific, and it was the day that they started. Finally got some flights out of the airport so they could start evacuating people who had been flooded out, who had nothing. And so there was a mile-long line of people who were basically carrying everything they had in the world, in like a garbage bag. If they were lucky, they had a rolling suitcase. Standing in line, when they got to the front line, they were put on a plane, and they didn't know until that moment where they were going. It was just to get them out. So they might be going to Memphis, they might be going to Minneapolis, they might be going to Houston, but wherever. And it was just a shocking thing to see. And I had been talking to people, and it's happened that Reverend Jackson was there at the airport too. And I just ran into him, and neither of us could say anything. I mean, it's Reverend Jackson, and we just walked together for about 5 minutes, and he just looked out, and he didn't have words. That was the only time.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. What a beautiful man. So that certainly is a part of history that all of us in this room have gotten a chance to experience, a part of the American experience. Now let's talk about you and your experience in this book, which also is, you call it a personal history of America. And let's go all the way back to 1981. You were new at the Post, the Washington Post, and you did a piece about your family history, and you talked about that. Now here we are, 40-something years later. What took you so long to write this book?
Well, you know, I wrote a piece in 1981 about the house that I grew up in that had been built by my great grandfather, and some of the family history. What I knew of it then, I know a whole lot more now, and actually at the time, a lot of people I knew, friends, more experienced journalists, mentors, said, you know, that's a book. You need to do that book. And I kind of said, okay, yes, but life happened, and you know, I got a promotion, a different job. I became an editor. I did this. I did that. I went overseas. Had a family. Had, you know, life intervened. I actually did other books, but I always knew I would come back to this story at some point because I thought I had an unusually sort of long and documented history. Unusual, you know, in most African American families, it was kind of unusual, and my great grandfather had been a pack rat. He had saved everything, so I had all these speeches and records and you know, letters and everything, and it really wasn't until COVID when we all sort of went home and went inside, and I think metaphorically we went inside, and you know, this was at the end of the first of the first Trump administration, and still trying to figure out, like, what the hell was that? You know, like, what was that? And so I'm trying to figure that out. And I had brought a few things from the house, a few things, you know, one of my great-grandfather's speeches and stuff. And, you know, I took it out of the cabinet and started looking at it, and I started thinking, well, maybe this is the time. Maybe the time is now to do this story. And so that's not really why it took me so long. It took, you know, but that's what happened.
Yeah. You know, so many of us growing up, we had oral histories. We would talk to our family members. And so we had these oral histories. But what's, I think, unique about your experience is that you actually lived in a house with history all around you. And so for you, you never really thought about, you know, gathering this because it was all around you, gathering history.
Yeah, it was just there. I mean, the first thing you saw walking into my house was the picture of Major Fordham, my great-grandfather, kind of very sternly looking down from the wall above the mantel. And in the bedroom that had been his bedroom, there was a great big old black safe, like a cartoon safe, you know, like the Roadrunner would drop on the head of Wile E. Coyote.
This is a picture of him, by the way.
And that's Major Fordham, and that's the picture that you saw. That's the first thing you saw when you came into my house. And inside were all these old papers, and it was just there. Some of the furniture from his era was still in the house, and plus two of his daughters were also living in the house, my grandmother and my great aunt. And so I you know, I guess you don't notice the water if you're a fish, and I was like a fish in water. Water of history. Right.
And your grandmother, she didn't allow you to go into that chest, did she? Did she let you look at it?
I wasn't supposed to.
Right, right.
I wasn't supposed to go in and take papers out of there, but, you know, I was curious.
So over time, you decided to really take a closer look into your great-great-grandfather's life, and you had to go outside of the house. And that led you to something called the Free Negro Book. Talk about that journey and the fact that there was even something that existed called the Free Negro Book.
Right. So, so one of the things I knew was that my great-great-grandfather, Major Fordham's father, whose name was Henry Fordham, I knew that he had become free. I knew that he had been enslaved and that he had become free before the Civil War. That document there, which I found in the course of researching this book, that's the record of my great-great-grandfather's sale to a plantation owner in Charleston, South Carolina, named Richard Fordham in 1829. And he was then, a boy named Harry. That was who he was. He was purchased by Richard Fordham, and so he became Henry Fordham. And I found that he had been sold in 1829 and then sold again to a Charleston businessman in 1848, and that he had obtained his freedom somewhere between 1848 and 1860, which was when he showed up in a Charleston census as Henry Fordham, FPC, free person of color. And so I knew it was in that, but that's a 12-year gap. And when I set out to do this book, one of the things I really wanted to try to pin down was, when was it, in that 12-year, and I just couldn't find it. I looked and I looked. I went to, there's the South Carolina Historical Society, which is in Charleston, is a treasure trove of documents, but there was no systematic collection of manumissions. And so there was no sort of central archive to look in, and I kept going back, and I was looking and couldn't find anything. And finally, on one visit, a librarian said, why don't you look at the Free Negro Book? And I was like, the what?
Right.
And so every year, free African Americans in Charleston were required to pay a tax of $2.75, I guess, for the privilege of being a free black person, and their names were duly recorded in what was actually called the Free Negro Book. It's like on the title page, Free Negro Book, and the authorities in Charleston really wanted to keep track of free black people because they weren't sure that should be a thing anyhow. Being free and black didn't make sense to a lot of them, and let's be clear, very few African Americans in Charleston were in fact free. And the vast majority were enslaved. My great-great-grandfather was a blacksmith, and he had used, he had been jobbed out by his owners and to do blacksmithing work, and he had gotten to keep a small percentage of that money, and he eventually accumulated enough to buy his own freedom. So this librarian started bringing out these microfilmed copies of the Free Negro Book year after year, and I started in 1848, and you just kind of go through and looking for his name, and finally in the 1851 edition, under F, I found Henry Fordham for the first time. So at least I could narrow it down that far, and he was in all the subsequent editions, none of the prior. So, so I could be pretty sure that that was when he became free.
I love it in the book when you describe that moment.
Oh yes, it was embarrassing because I'm in this library, right? This is this hushed inner sanctum
Right.
of the library at the College of Charleston, and I just let out this yes, yes. It was, but
Right. And the fact that there was something called the Free Negro Book, it still blows my mind.
Oh,
and that
unbelievable.
Right.
It is unbelievable, but literally called the Free Negro
Right.
Book.
And because of his trade, he was able to purchase his own freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. But, interestingly, though, of course, and this is actually not surprising, that was a very tenuous status, right? Because, yes, you were free, but you weren't white.
Right. Exactly.
You were not a white person. And particularly in the decade, really the decade of his freedom, before the Civil War, it got harder and harder for him and the other few free African Americans in Charleston to survive, really, to hold on to their freedom, because Charleston was a hotbed of secession, a hotbed of and as the 1860 election approached, there were bills debated in the South Carolina legislature that were basically, to decree that there was no such thing as a free black person anymore, and we would they're all enslaved again, and we'll just grab them and return them all to slavery. That was never passed, but some people, who didn't have the right papers or whatever, were in fact snatched off the street and sent down the river into slavery, and quite a few other free black people in Charleston just left. They went north to Canada was a safer place because of the Fugitive Slave Act. That if you went to New York, you could still be grabbed by and that wasn't you could be grabbed and sent back south. So, but the deal was that for a free black person, if you left the state of South Carolina, you could never come back. And so, but Henry Fordham, my great-great-grandfather, decided to stay. So he stayed.
So Henry's son, he and his wife's only child, Major John Hammond Fordham, was quite the formidable man. He was a Reconstruction success story, prominent in the Republican Party then, what was the Republican Party then, and he actually built the house that you were talking about.
The house that I grew up in, and he was just the right age to take advantage of that brief window of Reconstruction when Union troops were still occupying the South and protecting these newly won rights of African Americans. And so he went to school at the Avery Normal Institute, which was the first school for African Americans, secondary school for African Americans in Charleston. He was tutored in the law, became a lawyer, passed the South Carolina bar, set up a law practice, got active in the Republican Party, became kind of a politico, held various offices in South Carolina Republican Party, and went to all the national Republican, conventions and inaugurations for decades. And he had a federal job. I think it was a patronage job as a tax collector. And he built the house in 1903 that I grew up in with the big old black safe.
The big old black safe, yes. And the house was built in 1903. Tell us about this image. This is obviously not the picture, but talk about this drawing.
Well, yeah, this was actually painted by my late wife, Avis, who was an artist. That was actually her third career, her successive career, and she was an extraordinary person. And my editor and I decided that rather than use a photograph of the house, it would be nice to use her drawing of the house. She had really encouraged me to investigate and document the family history, and I think she understood before I did, really, that number one, African American history is just nothing but American history. Right. It is American history. There's no American history without African American history. It would be a very different country. It certainly wouldn't be this country. And how and to make me understand how important it was to to capture and to elaborate and to really research this history, because it just simply hadn't been done. These stories hadn't been told, and so it's really a tribute to Avis that we wanted to use that.
To use this, and what emotions do you feel when you actually see the house? Memories that come back to you.
Well, when I see this, I'm flooded with emotion. I'm seeing Avis, and I'm seeing my parents and my grandmother and great aunt. When I'm actually in Orangeburg and I'm standing in front of the house, I'm seeing the work that my sister and I need to do because it's a house that was built in 1903. Right.
They still own the house. You all still own the house.
Yeah, we still have the house. My sister lives in Orangeburg, and but not in the house. But actually, she's we're now doing some sort of deferred maintenance that needed to be done, and also figuring out how to sort of preserve it going forward. It's on because of Major Fordham's prominence in South Carolina and his accomplishments. The house is actually on the National Register of Historic Places, and there are two historically black colleges in Orangeburg: Claflin University, where my mother was a longtime head librarian, and South Carolina State University. I see an SC State sweatshirt right there, so I'm hopeful that we can sort of come up with some arrangement with the Claflin or SC State. I think the house it could be used as a kind of study center. There's a lot there. So anyhow, that's to come.
Yeah. So I want to look at that photo again of Major Hammond. Did we see that photo? I think we saw that photo at the very
Major Fordham, yeah.
Fordham, yeah. We saw that photo.
Yeah.
That is there it is, your great-grandfather. And you mentioned that when he passed away, there was no will.
No, it was when his father passed away.
When his father passed away, there was no will.
His father passed away, when Henry Fordham passed away.
And that created some drama.
Yeah, it really created some drama because his possessions, including, I think there were two pieces of property that he owned. He had two houses in Charleston, and there was one house after Henry Fordham's death that my great-grandfather, Major Fordham, right there, wanted to sell, and his mother, Henry Fordham's widow, Maria, did not want to sell the house. And this was obviously a point of real contention because Major Fordham sued his mother in court to try to make her sell this house, and he lost. Because the court ruled that no, it's her house and she doesn't have to sell it if she wants to. And actually, she, in her will, which I managed to find, Maria Fordham, his mother, actually left that house to one of the two women with whom Henry Fordham had been sold in 1829 to Richard Fordham. So obviously they had stayed in touch. I couldn't really find much else about these women, but one was named Hagar, and I forget the other's name. Had died younger, but Hagar was still alive, and so she ended up getting the house.
She got, yeah. We have a great audience question. How did Major Fordham survive Jim Crow?
You know, he, so you can see in his papers, even if all you do is look at the financial documents, you can see the years and the 1880s going into the 1890s when he's going great guns, and he's making money, he's buying property, he's making small loans to people that are getting paid back and stuff like that, and obviously prospering, and then you can see it level off as Jim Crow, as that vice tightens, and his horizons are shortened, his possibilities are become limited. He can't practice law the way he had practiced law. And the Republican Party became less important and less influential, and he loses his federal job, and so you can see in the financial papers, you can see that there's a point at which he's not buying property, he's selling property, and he's not lending money, he's borrowing money, but he had built up enough of a cushion. Not that he was ever like wealthy, but he had sort of built up enough of a cushion that he was, they kept the house, and his, he had made sure that his sons and daughters were educated, and there were some lean years, but the family managed to survive.
He was Major Fordham, a very strict father, and he instilled education, as you were saying, religion, but you discovered that later in life, something happened with your great aunt Florella, who you all called Aunt Doc. Doc. Something rather dramatic happened.
Well, I found out something dramatic, right? So Aunt Doc was Major Fordham's oldest daughter, first daughter, and we called her Aunt Doc because she was a nurse. She had gone to Claflin University, and she wanted to become a nurse. If you were a black woman, or really if you were a woman in those days, we're talking, around the turn of the 20th century, you could become a teacher or you could become a nurse. And her sisters became teachers and she became a nurse. So she went off to Hampton Institute, and she, where there was a nursing school in Virginia, and came back. She was the first accredited nurse, black or white, in Orangeburg. And she, she lived with us when I was growing up, or we lived with her. She had been the head nurse at South Carolina State and for a long time, and by the time I was a little kid, she had really just moved literally across the fence and become the head nurse at Claflin University. And she always wore her crisp white uniform when she went off to work. She never married. And so there was that. But my mother was an only child, but she had a whole bunch of first cousins who always came home from Cincinnati or Buffalo or whatever, and they would and she and my grandmother and my great aunt would always explain to me, okay, now that's your great uncle Marion's daughter, right? Dorothy is. They would explain the family tree to me. There was one cousin who would come, and it was cousin Rosalie, one of my mother's cousins, And I remember asking my mom, and I must have probably 8 or 9, so who was Cousin Rosalie? And she said, we don't know. Okay, and so I knew at a very young age that that was not true. Okay,
Right,
obviously,
right.
but whenever I like pressed the point, I just never got an answer from her or my grandmother. They just shut it down. So okay, so mystery, right? And so what I discovered in researching this book is that Cousin Rosalie was Aunt Doc's daughter, and which made perfect sense. Cousin Rosalie lived in New York, and she would come to visit every once in a while, and she would spend most of her time with Aunt Doc. And in fact, she looked exactly like Aunt Doc, right? She was a little taller, but they had the exact same face. So it was like a total aha moment. Of course, Cousin Rosalie was, and of course, all of them had passed away at this point, so I couldn't ask. There was nobody to ask, but I did find that out, and so so you look into family history, and sometimes there are little surprises there.
Right.
But it did make me wonder. She would have been. She obviously was welcomed into the family, and by my calculation, there were times when Aunt Doc was away studying that I presume her mother and the other women in the house would have taken care of the baby. But nobody talked to me about it. So, or talked about it publicly.
So we've been talking about your mother's side.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's move to your father's side. In the 1920s, the family was part of the Great Migration, ending up in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
And that is where you are from. Tell us about that exodus and how that happened.
Yeah, so that's where my dad grew up. And my dad was born in rural Georgia. And as you said, I think they started moving when he was like 3, and making their way north. And they ended up in Ann Arbor. This was really hard to research my dad's side of the family, because he was of that sort of taciturn, great generation kind of, he didn't share a lot about. He just didn't talk that much.
Talk about that.
They didn't talk that much, and neither did his brothers, the ones that I knew. And so, but I managed to get some help from a genealogist, actually the public library in Columbus, Ohio, who managed to help me dig out a bunch of that family history, which was really amazing. That's my dad in his World War II uniform. And
he was a good-looking man, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was
sharp.
And this is black and white, but my mother said that it was his eyes.
Yes.
That and that her friend described them as apricot eyes.
Oh,
he had
yes.
these light sort of. I would say they were more hazelnut, but they called them apricot eyes. And so at this time when this photograph was taken, he had 3 brothers. And his siblings, there were 4 boys and 2 girls, and all 4 of the men went into the armed forces during World War II. 3 of them, including my dad, into the Army, and 1 into the Navy. So, and actually the Ann Arbor News did a little story about that, about my grandma Robinson and her, the local woman who had sent 4 boys off to the war.
So then your father did the unthinkable after being educated at the University of Michigan and obtaining his law degree at Wayne State University in Detroit, right? He traced the Great Migration route in reverse. He moved permanently to the South.
Yeah. In the early 1950s, right, and so Jim Crow was in its last violent throes, entering its last violent throes, right, and so he had right after the war, he was still in the Army and he was stationed somewhere near Atlanta, and my mother was in Atlanta getting a master's degree in library science at Atlanta University, and they met at a dance, and and so they courted for a while, but it seems like that was pretty much it for the two of them, so they got married in 1952, and my dad's idea was that they would move to Detroit, and he was going to go into law practice with his older brother, Francis, and so that was the plan, and so they got married and they moved to Detroit, and I think they lasted there about a year, and that was that was it. My mother hated it. She hated the cold. She didn't she couldn't find the kind of job that she wanted.
That was the cold, yeah.
and the cold, and so at the beginning of 1954, two things happened, or two things were happening. Number one, my mother's father, my grandfather Eugene Smith, died suddenly, and so they came home from Detroit to see about my grandmother, who's there on the left, and that's Eugene Smith on the other side, and my mom in the middle, and so and then the other thing that was happening was that my mother was hugely pregnant with me. And so they got to Orangeburg, and it didn't seem to make sense to go all the way back to Detroit when I was about to be born, and, like in a month. And then my father just gave up. He just said, okay. It seemed like my grandmother and great aunt were at that point alone in the house, and that didn't seem... my mother didn't like that, and my dad didn't like it either, and so they decided, okay, we'll give up on the Detroit thing, and so he moved south, into second-class citizenship again.
Yeah. Why in the world would someone do this?
For love. That's the only reason.
For love, right.
Yeah.
So did a theme emerge for you as you were digging into your genealogy about, some steps forward and some steps backward? And
that's exactly what I thought. Just doing this whole book, the two things that jumped out at me, number one was what I said earlier, that African-American history, thank God for Black History Month, because we unearth and discuss a lot of history that nobody bothered to learn and teach in the past. But as should be every month, it is just American history. That's all it is. And I could see, my ancestors either participated in or witnessed or went through, every big and little event that happened in the country over 200 years. They were there. And their experience of it was, and in general, African Americans' experience of those events might be a little different, might be a little distinctive. There might be things that were important to us that weren't as important to some other people. Like I learned about the Red Summer of 1919, which I didn't know was a thing. I didn't know that in 1919, as soldiers all came home from World War I, across the country there was a series of bloody white-on-black race riots in cities across the country that left a bunch of people dead. The worst incident was a massacre of scores, if not hundreds, of black farmers in Arkansas. But there was a huge riot in Washington, D.C., a huge riot, even bigger riot in Chicago, city after city after city, that whole summer. And so that's something that, we remember. We have this sort of a memory of as a really seminal, that maybe other people wouldn't say, but it happened. It's part of his. So that's one thing, and the other thing was this pattern, and hence the title, Freedom Lost, Freedom Won, of African Americans would fight and struggle and work and die to obtain a bit more of the freedom and opportunity that's promised by the Declaration of Independence and the founding documents of this country, and then achieve that, and then it would be taken away, or some or all of it would be taken away, and it was this 3 steps forward, and then 2 steps back, 3 steps back, 4 steps back, and the obvious big example, Reconstruction, then Jim Crow, but I saw other sort of smaller versions of this cycle that affected African Americans in large numbers, that affected my family, and specifically, in which that was the case. It was, and that, seeing this repeated pattern certainly helped me understand, for example, how it could be that the first African American president is elected and then reelected, and then immediately afterwards, Donald Trump is elected.
Right.
And so it made a lot of sense to me to see this as the latest turn of that wheel.
Speaking of all this history and moving steps forward and steps backwards, we have an audience question. When you see actions from the Trump administration removing African-American historical markers and other markers and achievements, what do you think about the country's direction?
I don't think a lot of it. I think it's like, don't get me started on this, right? Because and not just because I've spent all this the past 4.5 years steeped in Black history, but again, it really is the nation's history, and it cheapens that history and cheapens the nation to try to pretend it didn't happen. And that just, I won't allow it. I mean, I take it very personally. I will not allow this. When I left the Washington Post last year, which we can talk about at some point, and I wrote what I thought was the final column about a new documentary about Katharine Graham, and I wrote a column about that, and I said, okay, that's great. That's gonna be my last column in the Washington Post, and a nice exclamation point, and kind of middle finger toward what the Post was becoming, and but then like later, the next week. The Trump administration started this nonsense about somehow censoring Black history and getting rid of any history that makes anybody uncomfortable. And so I got to do another column. So my wife Avis was a collector of African American historical documents and artifacts, and one of the first things she collected was a document like the one, kind of like the one you saw about Henry Fordham. This was a completely handwritten document recording the sale of a Negro girl and her son in Rhode Island in the year 1776. And this document had been, we loaned years ago, we loaned this document to a traveling exhibition called America I Am, which was, went to museums around the country. This is before the African American Museum was built in Washington. And in this exhibition, which was organized, I think, by Tavis Smiley, actually, they hung that document of the sale of this woman and her child in 1776 next to an original copy of the Declaration of Independence. And so there you had it, the two faces of 1776, these two things happening in 1776. And the thing that is infuriating and frankly incomprehensible is that these people can look at that and not understand that it is actually the story of trying to bridge that gap between the sale of human beings and all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. That's the story of this nation's history. Right. Really, it is. That's what we fought a civil war over. That's and extending that recognition and those rights to more and more people, to African Americans, to women, to Latinos, to Japanese Americans after they were interned, to LGBTQ plus people, is it's a great story, and but more important, it is the story. It is what happened, and so I had to write that column, and I had to write this book, and I will never shut up about this.
Just a little bit about the exhibition that you were talking about. This is called the African American Imprint. It's a major 10,000 square foot traveling museum exhibition and a book series that was curated by Tavis Smiley, a broadcaster, and it highlights 400 years of African American contributions to U.S. history. That's what you were talking about. Yeah. And speaking of history, let's go back to President Obama, because this is coverage that you did while you were at the Washington Post that won you a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, as you were covering this, it was an emotional evening when you were covering the night of the election of President Obama.
Oh, it really was. I mean, I had followed the campaign. I had seen early on the effect that Obama had on like all white audiences in Iowa, right, where you literally could not find a person of color who was not even either a journalist or on the Obama advance team. I mean, it was just but he had a way of sort of not just reaching people, but making them see a better version of themselves and their country, and inspiring them. I knew that, and I saw what was happening during the primary season, and I saw when it got to the point where, Obama would get the nomination, and then I saw what the polls were saying in the general election, and he was way ahead of McCain, and he was gonna win. And so on election night, I was at MSNBC. I was there, and but there was still a little voice in the back of my head that was just saying, "Nah, this is not going to happen. This country is not going to elect a black man as president of the United States." And at 11:15, roughly, I was sitting there with Rachel Maddow, David Gregory, Chris Matthews, and Keith Olbermann. And so we hear through our earpieces that at 11, the network was going to call the election for Obama. And my first thought was, gee, when they call the election for Obama, they're going to go to the black guy. So I better think of something to say. Try to think of something to say. And my second thought was, I hope we have a break before 11, and we did. And so I had my cell phone, and I called my mom and dad, and this was the last year of my father's life. He only had, we didn't know at the time, but he only had a couple months to live. But his health had been failing. My mother, he was 92, my mother was 87. And to tell them that, they had lived to see the election of the first black president was a moment that is just one of the high points of my life, and a moment I will never forget. And I, as I was doing this book, I kept thinking about the world, and the country they were born into and the country they left. And it just, I get emotional thinking about it now. So sure enough, they did. As soon as they said Obama is our next president, they say, David Gregory turns and says, "Gene." So I came up with something to say.
All right, this is from the audience. We miss your voice as a national columnist, especially on the presidential front. There is, yes, we really do.
Thank you.
So there is so much to say, but what would your column this morning say if you were writing one? Yeah, what would that say?
Oh, boy. Well, it's all backed up now. You see, I've been writing for months and months, so I would, where would I start? I would probably, today, I guess I'd probably be writing about the war, but I would have had, I would have had a lot to say about the first months of the Trump administration. I did the column for almost exactly 20 years, and I always told myself I don't want it to get stale. I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself. And I didn't know after Trump got elected in 2024. I was like, oh, geez, this again? Are we going to do this again? And I was trying to figure out ways of, like, how can I approach this new Trump administration other than just a long primal scream? How can I approach this? But then the sort of onslaught of the early days of the Trump administration, you just had to write about the stuff that was happening because there were 10 horrible things that were happening every day, and it just felt important to me, and I know to my fellow columnists, just to bear witness to this, right? And so, as few as possible would totally escape notice. And I would, on my column days, I would sit down and say, okay, what are we not writing about? What are my colleagues not writing about that needs to be focused on? And then I would focus on that. And I guess, that is probably what I would still be doing, but things changed at the Washington Post, and I was not happy, to say the least, when at the last possible moment, the owner, Jeff Bezos, decided not to endorse or not to publish the already written and edited editorial endorsing Kamala Harris over Trump. That was bad. But then when Bezos announced that, henceforth, the opinion pages would be all about personal liberties and free markets. And I like those, I like personal liberties. I like free markets. I also like social justice. I like, lots of other things that I think are important. And it was made clear that this was really a sharp turn to the right, that the pages were taking, and that the arrangement or the unwritten rule that had been the case for my entire 45 years at the Washington Post, which was basically that a column was a sovereign country. And it didn't matter what the editorial board said. The column, you could write what you wanted to say and what you believed, and that was no longer the case, or would no longer be the case. And so I decided that writing a column for the Washington Post was something I had done, and I had really, it felt like a privilege, and I had thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it, but I couldn't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. So I left.
Yeah.
I will I at some point start doing like column-like pieces someplace, maybe. I actually have signed up to be a contributing writer at the Atlantic, and
okay.
along with many of my fellow refugees. The rest are at the New York Times, and a couple at the Wall Street Journal, and far too many, especially after this recent rounds of cuts, far too many fabulous, great journalists who don't yet have jobs, which is just unspeakable. But when I left the Post for 2 weeks, I just wandered around and like, what do I do? I don't have a deadline. What do I do? What do I do? And then it literally took me a couple of weeks to realize, idiot, you've been working on this book. You're almost done with it. Simon & Schuster is like tapping its foot, right? like, for you to finish this book. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you're going to do. And then you'll figure out what you're going to do next.
You are figuring it out. Thank you so much, Gene, for spending time with us this evening. We appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you too. Thank you so much for great questions, and thank you all for coming out. This really is what sort of keeps me going, and because sometimes, sitting in Washington, you can, it's okay every once in a while to feel overwhelmed and to feel that everything is just going inexorably to hell. So it's great to come out and talk to good people, about interesting things and actual facts as opposed to alternative facts. and fantasies and dystopian fantasies. And you know, in the book, Donald Trump does make an appearance toward the end, but that's something I told myself every day. You know, not everything is about Donald Trump.
Yes.
You know, and yes, there are lessons about Donald Trump in this book, but you know, I'm not writing a book about Donald Trump. You know, he doesn't deserve it. So not everything is about him. And so thank you all for being here.
Thank
you,
you,
Leah.
Jay.
Thank you.